They called it training. They called it discipline. They called it proving your worth. But when Drill Instructor Sergeant Marcus Blake roared those 3 words, "Finish her off," and 12 Marines closed in like predators circling wounded prey, everyone knew this had nothing to do with training. This was about elimination, about sending a message that some people would never belong in his domain, no matter how many obstacles they conquered or how fast they ran. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers stood in that circle with 3 fractured ribs and blood seeping from her split lip, every breath feeling like shattered glass piercing her lungs. But she didn't retreat, didn't plead, didn't shed a single tear. She simply adjusted her stance, rolled her shoulders once, and gave them exactly what they were asking for. What unfolded wasn't just a fight, it was a reckoning. When the dust settled and 12 Marines lay sprawled across the dirt like fallen soldiers, Sergeant Blake didn't just lose his authority, he lost everything. Now, before we reveal exactly how a woman with broken ribs dismantled an entire squad and spoke the words that ended Blake's career in one devastating sentence, tap that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because this wasn't just about proving herself, it was about rewriting the rules. And this time, the rules hit back harder than anyone could have imagined. The desert sun beat down on Camp Sentinel like a molten hammer, transforming the training compound into an inferno that made the sand shimmer like liquid silver. This wasn't some comfortable base with air-conditioned barracks and easy assignments. This was where they sent Marines to either discover their breaking point or shatter completely trying. The Advanced Combat Training Facility sat in the middle of the Arizona wasteland, a collection of concrete bunkers, brutal obstacle courses, and fighting pits surrounded by razor wire and endless desert. No comfort, no mercy, no excuses, just heat, sweat, and the kind of training that separated true warriors from pretenders. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers stepped off the transport truck at 600 hours, her desert camouflage already soaked with perspiration, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun that hadn't shifted despite the 3-hour journey through hell. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd earned every stripe on her sleeve through blood and determination. 2 combat tours in Afghanistan, a Bronze Star for valor, and a reputation for being tougher than steel. But none of that mattered here. At Sentinel, reputation was just noise until you proved it in the dirt. And the man who decided who proved what was Drill Instructor Sergeant Marcus Blake, a human sledgehammer wrapped in Marine Corps green who'd been breaking recruits and crushing dreams for 8 years straight. Blake stood at the edge of the main training pit, arms crossed like tree trunks, his voice carrying across the compound like thunder. "Listen up, meat puppets. You think you're Marines because you survived basic? You think you're hard because you got through infantry training? You're nothing. You're less than nothing. You're mistakes that somebody forgot to flush." 12 Marines stood at attention in the blazing sun, their faces stone masks of concentration. These weren't fresh-faced recruits straight from boot camp. These were hardened infantry Marines with combat experience, men who'd seen real fire and lived to tell about it. But under Blake's glare, they looked like terrified children trying not to wet themselves. Rivers moved to join the formation, her boots crunching on the sun-baked earth. Every eye tracked her movement, not because she was the only woman, but because she carried herself differently. No fear, no hesitation, just the calm confidence of someone who'd already walked through hell and come out smiling. Blake's eyes locked onto her like a predator spotting wounded prey. "Well, well, well, what do we have here? Somebody send us a secretary by mistake?" His voice dripped with contempt that could corrode steel. "This is advanced combat training, sweetheart, not a typing pool." Rivers didn't flinch, didn't react, just maintained her position of attention. Her gray eyes, cold as winter mountain streams, stayed fixed straight ahead. She'd heard it all before, in basic training, in infantry school, in the desert camps of Helmand Province. Words were just air unless you let them become something more. You got something to say, Staff Sergeant? Blake stepped closer, his breath hot against her face. Or are you just going to stand there looking pretty? Ready to train, drill instructor, Rivers replied, her voice steady as bedrock. Same as everyone else. Blake's laugh was like gravel being poured into a cement mixer. Same as everyone else? Princess, you ain't the same as anyone here. These men are warriors. He paused, looking her up and down like she was something unpleasant he'd stepped in. You're an experiment that's about to fail. But would the experiment fail? Or was Blake about to learn a lesson he'd never forget? The other Marines shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Rivers and Blake. They'd all heard stories about women trying to make it through advanced training. They'd also heard stories about what happened to the ones who didn't know when to quit. Rivers's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. But she said nothing, just absorbed the words like armor-absorbing bullets. She'd learned long ago that the loudest person in the room was usually the most afraid, and fear made people dangerous in unpredictable ways. All right, ladies, Blake bellowed, turning back to address the formation. Today, we're going to separate the sharks from the guppies. Combat conditioning, full contact, no safety gear, no time limits, no mercy. Last person standing gets chow first. Everyone else eats dirt. He pointed at Rivers with one thick finger. And since our little visitor here thinks she belongs, she gets to go first, against all of them. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Let's see how long this experiment lasts in the real world. The training pit fell silent except for the whisper of desert wind across sand and the distant rumble of jets practicing overhead maneuvers. 12 Marines looked at Rivers with expressions ranging from pity to anticipation. None of them looked away. Rivers stepped forward, rolling her shoulders once, her hands relaxed at her sides. She'd been here before. Not this exact place, but this exact moment. The moment when everything hung in balance, when choices made in seconds would echo for years. Blake's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Rules are simple, sweetheart. Survive or go home. No crying, no quitting, no calling for mama. He raised his hand like a starter at a race. And remember, boys, I want you to finish what you start. In the distance, a buzzard circled overhead, riding the thermals with patient grace. Even the scavengers knew something was about to go very wrong, or very right, depending on whose side you were on. The barracks at Camp Sentinel weren't built for comfort. They were built to break spirits, concrete walls that wept condensation in the desert heat, metal bunks that creaked like old bones, and fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry wasps 24 hours a day. The air conditioning had given up the ghost sometime during the Clinton administration, and nobody had bothered to fix it. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers dropped her duffel on the narrow bunk assigned to her, the sound echoing through the nearly empty building like a gunshot. The other Marines had already claimed their territory, personal photos taped to lockers, gear arranged with military precision, small comforts that marked their space as home, however temporary. Her space felt different, colder, like the building itself was rejecting her presence. Rivers unpacked with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything else. Combat boots arranged heel to toe, uniforms hung with exact spacing. Personal items, a worn paperback novel, a photo of her parents at their restaurant in Chicago, a small silver pendant from her grandmother, placed with deliberate care. She didn't hurry, didn't look around for approval or acceptance. She'd learned long ago that belonging wasn't something you could ask for. You had to take it. The main training compound sprawled across 40 acres of hard-pan desert, dotted with obstacle courses that looked like medieval torture devices reimagined by sadistic engineers. The confidence course featured 20-foot rope climbs in full gear, log carries that weighed more than most motorcycles, and mud pits that never quite dried out despite the relentless Arizona sun. But the centerpiece was the combat conditioning arena, a circular pit 50 feet across, surrounded by concrete bleachers and covered with sand that had been stained dark by sweat, blood, and the occasional tear. This was where careers were made and broken, where reputation became reality, where the strong separated themselves from everyone else. Rivers walked the perimeter during her first evening, studying the layout with the tactical eye of someone who'd survived 2 combat deployments. Every angle, every sight line, every potential advantage cataloged and filed away. The sand was deeper on the north side, better footing for lateral movement. The concrete walls were slightly higher on the east, potential cover if things went sideways. Not that she expected things to go sideways, but expecting the worst had kept her alive this long. "Checking out your future grave?" The voice came from behind her, casual but loaded with menace. Rivers turned slowly to find Corporal Ryan Thompson leaning against the fence, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across half the arena. Thompson was built like a linebacker who decided football wasn't violent enough, all shoulders and scars and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "Just getting familiar with the space," Rivers replied evenly. "Same as I'd do anywhere else." Thompson pushed off from the fence, his boots crunching in the gravel. "Anywhere else, sure. But this ain't anywhere else, sweetheart. This is Sentinel. We do things different here." 2 more Marines materialized from the shadows near the equipment shed. Sergeant Eric "Tank" Martinez and Corporal Billy Wayne Cooper. Martinez was shorter but thicker, built like a fire hydrant with anger management issues. Cooper was lean and mean, with the kind of pale eyes that belonged on a shark. "Different how?" Rivers asked, though she already knew the answer. "Different like we don't pretend," Martinez said, stepping closer. "We don't play nice for the cameras. We don't worry about hurt feelings or safe spaces or any of that politically correct garbage." Cooper nodded agreement. "We train like we fight, hard, fast, and permanent. Some people can handle that reality. Others," he shrugged, "others find reasons to transfer out before they get embarrassed." "What did Rivers say that made these 3 Marines back down?" "Keep watching to find out." Rivers looked at each of them in turn, reading their body language like a tactical manual. Thompson was the muscle, intimidating but probably not the brains of the operation. Martinez was angry about something that had nothing to do with her, just looking for someone to take it out on. Cooper was the dangerous one, cold and calculating, the type who'd smile while he stuck a knife between your ribs. "I appreciate the warning," she said finally, "but I'm not planning on transferring anywhere." Thompson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Plans change, sweetheart, especially when reality comes calling." They walked away together, their boots raising small clouds of dust that drifted across the arena like smoke signals. Rivers watched them go, memorizing their movement patterns, their group dynamics, the way they communicated without words. She'd fought insurgents in Afghanistan who were less coordinated. The mess hall buzzed with the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of metal trays on metal tables. Rivers moved through the serving line like she belonged there, ignoring the stares and whispered comments that followed in her wake. "That's her," someone muttered behind her. "The one Blake's going to break. $5 says she quits by Friday. I got 10 that says she doesn't make it through the first real training exercise." Rivers ladled mashed potatoes onto her tray and grabbed a piece of cornbread that looked like it could double as body armor. The food at Sentinel was designed for function, not flavor. Carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle repair, grease to keep the machinery running. She found an empty table near the back corner and sat with her back to the wall, a habit from combat zones where empty spaces behind you were invitations for trouble. The meal tasted like cardboard and determination, but she ate every bite while scanning the room like a sniper reading terrain. 23 Marines total, 12 in her training group, 11 support staff and instructors, average age 26, All combat veterans, all volunteers for advanced training. The kind of men who'd signed up for the hardest job in the military because the regular military wasn't hard enough. And sitting at the head table like a king surveying his domain was drill instructor Sergeant Blake, cutting his steak with surgical precision while his eyes swept the room like searchlights. When his gaze found Rivers, it lingered longer than necessary, cold and calculating. He raised his water glass slightly in her direction. Not quite a salute, more like a challenge. Rivers raised hers in return, meeting his stare without flinching. The message was clear on both sides. Game on. Later that night, as the desert cooled and the stars emerged like pinpricks in black velvet, Rivers lay on her narrow bunk and listened to the sounds of the barracks settling around her. Snores from a dozen throats, the whisper of air through broken vents, the distant howl of coyotes hunting in the wasteland beyond the fence. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, stopping outside her door for just a moment before moving on. Testing, probing, looking for weakness. Rivers smiled in the darkness and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring pain, exhaustion, and probably blood. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in the eye of the storm, waiting for it to break. What happened the next morning would change everything. But first, would Rivers survive what Blake had planned? The morning alarm at Camp Sentinel didn't wake you up. It violated you awake. A klaxon that could wake the dead screamed across the compound at 0500 hours, followed by the thunderous voice of drill instructor Blake, echoing through every speaker in the barracks. "Rise and shine, maggots! Time to separate the warriors from the weekend warriors." Rivers was already awake, had been for 20 minutes, lying in the darkness and listening to the rhythm of the bass coming to life. Kitchen staff clattering pans in the mess hall, night watch Marines walking their final rounds, the distant rumble of supply trucks arriving with the day's provisions. She'd learned in Afghanistan that the moments before dawn were when attacks usually came, and old habits died hard. She swung her legs over the side of her bunk and began the morning routine that had become second nature over 8 years of military service. Shower in water that alternated between scalding and ice cold. Uniform inspection in the cracked mirror above the communal sink. Boots polished to a mirror shine that could signal aircraft from orbit. The mess hall was already buzzing when she arrived at 0530. Marines hunched over coffee that could dissolve paint and breakfast that looked like it had been prepared by someone who'd never actually eaten food before. Rivers grabbed a tray and moved through the serving line, ignoring the looks and whispered comments that followed her like smoke. "There she is," someone muttered from a corner table. "Wonder how long she'll last today." "My money's on 10 minutes. Soon as Blake gets warmed up." Rivers found a seat at an empty table and began methodically working through her breakfast. Eggs that tasted like rubber, bacon that crunched like gravel, orange juice that had apparently been squeezed from oranges that died of natural causes. Around her, the conversation gradually shifted from speculation about her to more mundane topics. Weekend plans, complaints about equipment, crude jokes that would make a sailor blush. She was halfway through her second cup of coffee when Corporal Thompson dropped into the seat across from her without invitation. His breakfast tray hit the table with enough force to make her juice glass jump. "Morning, sunshine," he said, his voice carrying just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "Ready for your first real day at summer camp?" Rivers didn't look up from her eggs. "Just another day at the office." Thompson laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "Office? That's cute. You think this is some kind of desk job?" "I think it's whatever I make it," Rivers replied, finally meeting his eyes. "Same as anywhere else." "Anywhere else?" Thompson repeated, shaking his head. "See, that's your problem right there. You keep thinking this place is like everywhere else. It ain't." Martinez slid into the seat beside Thompson, followed by Cooper and 3 other Marines from their training group. The table suddenly felt crowded, the air thick with testosterone and unspoken threats. "Nah, this place is special," Martinez said, stabbing his fork into a piece of sausage that looked like it had been carved from a tire. "This place strips away all the pretense, all the politically correct BS, all the feel-good nonsense about equality and inclusion, and everybody gets a trophy." Cooper nodded agreement. "Here, you either got what it takes or you don't. And if you don't," he shrugged, "well, there's always the motor pool. I hear they need someone to wash vehicles." The other Marines chuckled appreciatively. Not hostile laughter exactly, but the kind of amusement that came from watching someone walk into a trap they couldn't see yet. But Rivers had a response that would silence the entire table. "What did she say?" Rivers continued eating, her expression unchanged. She'd heard it all before, in different variations, from different mouths. The words changed, but the message was always the same. "You don't belong here. We don't want you here. Leave now before we make you leave." "You know what I think?" Thompson leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think you're here to prove some kind of point, some feminist statement about how women can do anything men can do." "Is that what you think?" Rivers asked mildly. "That's exactly what I think. And you know what else I think? I think you're going to find out real quick that some things aren't about proving points. Some things are about survival." The table fell silent except for the scrape of forks against metal trays and the low murmur of conversation from surrounding tables. Rivers finished her eggs, drained her coffee, and stood up with deliberate slowness. "Thanks for the insight," she said, picking up her tray. "I'll keep it in mind." She walked away without looking back, feeling their eyes on her like laser sights. Behind her, she heard Thompson's voice rise just loud enough to carry. 2 days. I'm betting she's gone in 2 days." The first formation of the day assembled in the main courtyard at Oro 6:30. 23 Marines arranged in perfect rows under a sky that was just beginning to blush pink with dawn. Drill Instructor Blake prowled the front rank like a caged predator, his eyes scanning each face for signs of weakness or fatigue. Rivers stood in the back row, her posture military perfect, her expression carefully neutral. Around her, she could feel the weight of expectations pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Every Marine in formation had an opinion about her presence, her purpose, her eventual failure. Blake stopped his prowling and turned to face the formation. "Ladies, today marks the beginning of your real education. Everything you learned in basic training was kindergarten. Everything you learned in infantry school was first grade. This is graduate school, and the curriculum is pain." A few Marines nodded appreciatively. Blake had a reputation for memorable speeches, the kind that got repeated in barracks around the world. "For the next 6 weeks, you will be tested in ways that will make your previous training look like a church picnic. Combat conditioning, advanced weapon systems, urban warfare tactics, survival training that would kill a lesser man." His eyes swept the formation like searchlights. "Some of you will excel, some of you will muddle through, and some of you—" His gaze found Rivers and lingered there like a sniper scope. "Some of you will discover that there's a difference between theory and practice, between what looks good on paper and what works in the real world." The silence that followed was heavy enough to press the sand flat beneath their boots. Blake let it stretch until it became uncomfortable, then smiled with all the warmth of a shark contemplating lunch. "But don't worry," he continued, his voice taking on a mocking sweetness. "If any of you find the training too challenging, too demanding, too far outside your comfort zone, there's always the option to request a transfer. No shame in knowing your limitations, no dishonor in admitting you're not cut out for the advanced course." Again, his eyes found Rivers. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is quit before you get hurt. Rivers stared straight ahead, her face carved from stone. She'd heard the message loud and clear. Had been hearing variations of it since the moment she'd stepped off the transport truck, but hearing it and accepting it were two very different things. Blake clapped his hands together once, the sound sharp as a rifle shot. "All right, maggots. Time to see what you're made of. First exercise, combat conditioning in the arena. Full contact, no protective gear. Last person standing wins bragging rights and first shot at chow." He turned to face Rivers directly. "And since our special guest here is so eager to prove herself, she gets the honor of going first, against everyone else." His smile could have cut glass. Rivers had a choice to make. Would she challenge this illegal order, or would she walk into the trap? The formation didn't move, but Rivers could feel the shift in energy, like an electrical charge building before lightning. This wasn't standard training protocol. This wasn't even close to regulation. This was designed to be a spectacle, a demonstration, a public execution disguised as an exercise. "Problem, Staff Sergeant?" Blake asked when Rivers didn't immediately respond. Rivers stepped forward one pace. "No problem, drill instructor, ready to proceed." "Outstanding. Arena 15 minutes. Everyone else, bleachers. This should be educational." As the formation dispersed, Rivers caught fragments of whispered conversation from the Marines around her. 12 against 1? That's not training. That's assault. Should we say something? Say something to who? Blake? You want to end up in there with her? This is messed up, even for Sentinel. But nobody said anything official. Nobody filed a complaint. Nobody stepped forward to object, because at Camp Sentinel, just like everywhere else in the military, there was what was right and what was regulation, and they weren't always the same thing. Rivers walked toward the arena alone, her boots raising small clouds of dust that drifted away on the morning breeze like smoke signals. Behind her, she could hear the scrape of boots on concrete as the other Marines climbed into the bleachers, positioning themselves for the best view of what promised to be either a very short fight or a very ugly one. In the distance, a buzzard circled overhead, riding the thermals with patient grace. Even the scavengers knew something was about to happen, something that would change everything. The combat conditioning arena sat in the center of Camp Sentinel like a gladiatorial pit transplanted from ancient Rome to the Arizona desert. 50 feet of sand surrounded by concrete bleachers that had been baking in the sun since dawn, the metal hot enough to brand flesh through fabric. The air shimmered with heat waves that made everything look like a mirage, as if the whole scene might dissolve into nothing if you stared too long. Rivers descended the concrete steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over the assembled Marines. 12 men already waited in the arena, spread out in a loose semicircle like wolves preparing to close on wounded prey. They'd stripped down to PT gear, shorts, T-shirts, and the kind of confidence that came from never having lost a fight they cared about. Thompson cracked his knuckles with the deliberate slowness of a man who enjoyed the sound. Martinez bounced on the balls of his feet, shadow boxing against invisible opponents. Cooper stood perfectly still, his pale eyes tracking Rivers's movement with the cold calculation of a predator sizing up prey. The other 9 Marines arranged themselves with practiced efficiency. Lance Corporal Williams, built like a heavyweight boxer with hands the size of dinner plates. Sergeant Jackson, wiry and quick, with scars that told stories about close-quarters combat. Corporal Peterson, who'd earned the nickname Hammer for obvious reasons. And standing at the edge of the arena like Caesar presiding over the games, drill instructor Blake surveyed the scene with the satisfied expression of a man watching his carefully laid plans come together. "Rules are simple," Blake announced, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Last person standing wins. No weapons, no protective gear, no time limits, no mercy." He paused, letting his eyes sweep the bleachers where the remaining Marines sat like spectators at a public execution. And no outside interference. What happens in the arena stays in the arena. Rivers reached the center of the sand and began her own preparation ritual, rolling her shoulders, stretching her neck, checking the tape on her hands that she'd applied with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this many times before. She didn't hurry, didn't show fear, didn't acknowledge the odds stacked against her like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You sure about this, Rivers?" Thompson called out, his voice carrying false concern. "Last chance to walk away with your dignity intact." Rivers finished her stretching and looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. Young faces, hard faces, faces that had seen combat and survived to talk about it. These weren't weekend warriors or basic training washouts. These were professional Marines, veterans of real fighting, men who'd earned their stripes in places where mistakes got you killed. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her voice steady as bedrock. Martinez laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Tough girl, huh? We'll see how tough you are when the real work starts." Blake raised his hand like a starter at a race, the gesture sharp and final. "Gentlemen, ladies," he said, the last word dripping with contempt. "Let's see what you're made of." Begin. What happened next would defy everything these Marines thought they knew about combat. But could Rivers really survive 12 trained killers? For a heartbeat, nobody moved. The arena held its breath, suspended between intention and action, like the moment before lightning strikes. Then Thompson stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the sand. "Nothing personal," he said, rolling his shoulders. "Just business." Rivers shifted her stance slightly, weight balanced on the balls of her feet, hands loose at her sides. She'd been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, written off before the fight even started. In Afghanistan, in training exercises that had gone sideways, in dark alleys where diplomacy had failed and violence was the only language left. Thompson moved first, testing her with a lazy jab that was more question than attack. Rivers slipped it easily, didn't counter, just reset and waited. The big man smiled and tried again, this time with real intent behind it, a straight right hand that could have taken her head off if it had connected. It didn't connect. Rivers moved like water flowing around a stone, the punch whistling past her ear close enough to ruffle her hair. She tapped Thompson's extended arm lightly, more acknowledgement than attack, then danced back out of range. "Fast," Martinez observed from the sideline, "but fast don't mean much when you're tired." The next attack came from multiple directions, Thompson pressing forward with heavy hands while Jackson circled to her left, and Cooper moved to cut off her retreat. Classic pack tactics, designed to overwhelm through coordination and numbers. Rivers absorbed the pressure without panic, reading the rhythm of their movement like sheet music. Thompson was the hammer, powerful but predictable. Jackson was the knife, quick but overcommitted. Cooper was the real danger, patient and calculating, waiting for the moment when she'd be too busy with the others to see him coming. She let Thompson get close enough to feel confident, then dropped low and swept his lead leg with surgical precision. The big man windmilled his arms, fighting for balance, and Rivers flowed into him like smoke, her elbow finding the nerve cluster just below his ribs. Thompson dropped to one knee, clutching his side, his face gray with pain and surprise. Rivers was already moving, flowing toward Jackson before the wiry Marine could adjust his angle of attack. "Holy shit!" someone whispered from the bleachers. "Did you see that?" Jackson came in fast and low, trying to tackle her around the waist. Rivers sprawled expertly, using his momentum against him, and Jackson found himself face first in the sand with Rivers's knee pressed against his spine. "Two down," Cooper observed clinically. 10 to go. The remaining Marines began to circle more carefully now, their casual confidence replaced by professional wariness. This wasn't the easy victory they'd expected. This was going to require actual work. Blake watched from his elevated position, his expression shifting from smug satisfaction to something harder to read. This wasn't going according to script. "Spread out," Williams commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Don't let her isolate us. Move as a group." The tactics changed immediately. Instead of individual attacks, they began flowing together like a single organism, cutting off angles, reducing her space, applying constant pressure without giving her time to recover or reset. Rivers found herself giving ground, stepping backward toward the arena wall as the circle tightened around her. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the early morning coolness, and her breathing had shifted from steady to controlled. This was harder work than the first exchanges, requiring constant movement and split-second timing. Peterson came in from the right, his famous sledgehammer hands seeking her ribs. Rivers blocked with her forearm, feeling the impact all the way to her shoulder, then twisted and drove her knee toward his midsection. Peterson doubled over, gasping. But Martinez was already moving to fill the gap. The young Marine was fast and hungry, throwing combinations that whistled through the air like artillery shells. Rivers weaved between them, her head movement fluid and economical, but she was giving ground again, the arena wall getting closer with each exchange. "She's running out of room," Martinez observed, still nursing his bruised ribs. Nowhere left to run. That's when Rivers made a choice that would change everything. What did she do next? Instead of continuing to retreat, Rivers stepped forward into the pressure, accepting the hits she couldn't avoid while delivering her own with surgical precision. Her fist found Martinez's solar plexus, doubling him over. Her elbow caught Williams in the temple, sending him staggering sideways into Peterson. But the numbers were starting to tell. Rivers's lip was split, blood trickling down her chin. Her left eye was beginning to swell where Jackson had tagged her before going down. Her ribs ached from Peterson's sledgehammer hands, each breath a reminder that she was fighting 12 trained killers with nothing but skill and stubbornness. Blake leaned forward on his concrete perch, his eyes bright with anticipation. This was going better than he'd hoped. The lesson would be complete, comprehensive, impossible to ignore. "Getting tired yet, sweetheart?" Thompson called out, back on his feet but moving gingerly. "We can keep this up all day." Rivers wiped blood from her mouth with the back of her hand and smiled for the first time since entering the arena. Not a pleasant smile, not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who just realized something important. "Just getting warmed up," she replied. And in the bleachers, Marines who'd been expecting a quick execution began to lean forward, suddenly uncertain about how this story was going to end. The morning sun climbed higher over Camp Sentinel, transforming the arena into a furnace that baked sweat into salt crystals on skin and made every breath feel like inhaling molten metal. The concrete bleachers radiated heat like blast furnaces, but none of the watching Marines moved to find shade. This had become something more than training, more than hazing, more than even entertainment. This had become a test that nobody wanted to miss. Rivers circled the remaining fighters with the fluid grace of someone who'd found her rhythm in chaos. 7 Marines still stood upright, though Thompson favored his left side where her elbow had found home, and Williams kept blinking to clear his vision after the temple shot. The others, Jackson, Martinez, Peterson, and Cooper's crew, sat in the sand or against the arena wall, breathing hard and wondering how the hell one woman had put them there. But 5 fresh Marines remained in the circle, and Blake had been busy during the brief lull. "Rotation!" the drill instructor barked from his perch. "Fresh blood in the arena! Sergeant Torres, Corporal Mason, Private Nash, you're up! Let's see if you can finish what these ladies started." 3 new fighters vaulted the low wall, separating the bleachers from the fighting pit. Sergeant Miguel Torres, built like a middleweight boxer with hands that moved like striking snakes. Corporal Keith Mason, a former college wrestler who'd traded academic scholarships for combat deployments. Private Danny Nash, young and hungry, with the kind of reckless courage that either got you medals or got you killed. The circle widened again, fresh legs and unbowed confidence joining the survivors of the first wave. Rivers counted quickly. 10 against 1 now, with reinforcements waiting in the bleachers if Blake decided the lesson needed more emphasis. "Problem, Staff Sergeant?" Blake called down, his voice carrying across the arena like a challenge. "Too many dance partners for you?" Rivers rolled her shoulders, working out a kink where Cooper's knee had found its mark. Her uniform shirt was dark with sweat and dust, her knuckles scraped raw from contact with faces and ribs, but her eyes remained clear, focused, calculating. "Just wondering if you're planning to keep adding fresh meat every time your boys get tired," she replied, loud enough for the entire arena to hear. "Or if this is actually supposed to be training." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the bleachers. Blake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Not anger, exactly, but the kind of annoyance that came from having someone call out your game in front of an audience. "This is about endurance, sweetheart, about learning to fight when you're tired, hurt, and outnumbered, about discovering what you're really made of when the chips are down." His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Unless you'd prefer to call it quits now. No shame in admitting you're outclassed." The arena fell silent except for the whisper of desert wind across sand and the distant rumble of jets practicing overhead maneuvers. Every eye was locked on Rivers, waiting to see if she'd take the offer, the escape route, or double down on a bet that was looking increasingly impossible to win. Rivers wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of sand and blood across her skin. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly in the desert air. "I didn't come here to quit, drill instructor. I came here to train. So let's train." Torres moved first this time, his boxing background evident in the way he cut angles and threw combinations. Fast hands, good footwork, professional technique that had been honed in gymnasium rings and perfected in combat zones. Rivers gave ground, absorbing what she couldn't avoid, her head movement keeping her clear of the worst shots. But while she was dealing with Torres, Mason circled behind her with the patient persistence of a wrestler who'd learned to wait for openings. He shot low while Rivers was committed to blocking one of Torres's hooks, his arms wrapping around her waist like steel cables. The takedown was textbook perfect, Mason driving through with his legs while Torres stepped clear, giving the wrestler room to work. Rivers hit the sand hard, Mason's weight settling on top of her like a concrete blanket, his hands already working to secure a submission hold. "Got her!" Mason grunted, his arms snaking around Rivers's neck. "Just need to—" Rivers's elbow found his ribs with surgical precision, the same nerve cluster she'd targeted on Thompson earlier. Mason's grip loosened involuntarily, and Rivers flowed out from under him like water escaping a broken dam. She rolled to her feet as Nash came charging in with the kind of bull rush that worked great against slower opponents, but left you exposed against someone who knew how to use momentum as a weapon. Rivers stepped aside at the last possible moment, her hip check sending Nash stumbling past her into Mason, who was still trying to shake off the effects of the elbow strike. Both men went down in a tangle of arms and legs and Marine Corps profanity. "She's learning," Cooper observed from the sideline, grudging respect in his voice, "using their aggression against them." But how much longer could Rivers keep this up? And what was Blake planning next? The tempo of the fight shifted again as more Marines joined the circle. Blake had abandoned any pretense of standard training protocol. This was about breaking her through sheer attrition, about proving that some barriers couldn't be crossed, no matter how much skill or determination you brought to the table. Fresh fighters rotated in every few minutes, maintaining constant pressure while Rivers had no chance to recover or reset. Her left eye was nearly swollen shut now, and each breath brought stabbing reminders that her ribs had taken serious damage. Blood from her split lip mixed with sweat and sand, creating a gritty paste that she had to keep spitting out to maintain clear vision. But she kept fighting. Torres caught her with a solid right hand that sent her staggering backward into the arena wall. The concrete was hot enough to raise blisters, but Rivers pushed off it immediately, refusing to give the circling Marines time to coordinate their next attack. Mason shot for another takedown, but this time, Rivers was ready. She sprawled expertly, using her weight to drive him face first into the sand, then spun away before the others could capitalize on her momentary ground position. "How long can she keep this up?" someone whispered from the bleachers. "Longer than you think," another voice replied. "Look at her breathing. She's pacing herself." It was true. Despite the punishment she was absorbing, Rivers's breathing remained controlled, economical. She was fighting smart, picking her shots, conserving energy for the exchanges that mattered most. This wasn't desperation. This was strategy. Blake leaned forward on his concrete perch, his expression shifting from confident anticipation to something harder to read. This wasn't going according to plan. The lesson was supposed to be simple, direct, undeniable. Some people belonged in elite combat training and others didn't. But the woman in the arena was rewriting the script with every exchange. Nash came in fast again, this time with backup from two fresh Marines who'd just vaulted into the pit. Rivers found herself pressed against the wall again, three sets of hands reaching for her, trying to grab, to hold, to pin her down long enough to end this embarrassing display of female stubbornness. That's when something shifted in Rivers's eyes. Not panic, not desperation, but the cold calculation of someone who'd just run out of patience with playing defense. She stepped into Nash's charge instead of away from it, accepting his punch while delivering her own to his throat. Nash dropped like he'd been shot, clutching his neck and making sounds like a broken engine trying to start. The other two Marines hesitated for just a moment, surprised by the sudden reversal of momentum. Rivers flowed into that hesitation like smoke through a crack, her hands and elbows finding targets with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a sledgehammer. Within seconds, two more Marines were sitting in the sand, reconsidering their career choices. The arena fell silent, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the whisper of wind across the desert. Marines who'd been rotating in eagerly just minutes before suddenly found reasons to check their equipment or tie their boots. Blake stood up on his concrete platform, his face flushed with heat and something that might have been embarrassment. This had gone far enough. The demonstration was supposed to prove a point, not create a legend. "Enough!" he barked. "Training exercise concluded. Everyone back to—" "No." The single word cut through the desert air like a rifle shot. Rivers stood in the center of the arena, sweat and blood and sand coating her like war paint. Her eyes fixed on Blake with the unwavering focus of a predator who'd just identified prey. "We're not finished here, drill instructor." What Rivers said next would end Blake's career forever. But first, would the other Marines let her continue? The silence that followed Rivers's declaration stretched across the arena like a taut wire ready to snap. Blake stood frozen on his concrete platform, his mouth slightly open as if her words had physically struck him. Around the bleachers, Marines leaned forward in their seats, sensing that something fundamental had just shifted in the carefully orchestrated drama playing out in the sand below. "Excuse me?" Blake finally managed, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that had silenced recruits and broken spirits across 2 decades of military service. Rivers stepped forward, her boots leaving deep impressions in the sand that had been churned into powder by an hour of combat. Despite the beating she'd absorbed, despite the swelling around her left eye and the blood that had dried into dark streaks across her chin, Her posture remained military perfect. Shoulders back, spine straight, eyes locked on the man who'd orchestrated her public humiliation. "I said we're not finished, drill instructor," she repeated, each word delivered with the precision of a sniper's bullet. "This was supposed to be training, right?" "Combat conditioning. Learning to fight when we're tired and hurt and outnumbered." Blake's face was turning an interesting shade of red that had nothing to do with the desert heat. "Staff Sergeant, you will stand down and—" "Then let's make it real training," Rivers continued, cutting through his words like a blade through silk. "No more rotating fresh fighters, no more stacking the deck, no more games." She gestured toward the Marines scattered around the arena, some still sitting in the sand where she'd put them. "Let's see what these warriors can do when they don't have the luxury of taking turns." A murmur ran through the bleachers like electricity through a conductor. This wasn't just insubordination. This was a direct challenge to Blake's authority in front of his entire command, the kind of challenge that couldn't be ignored or deflected or buried in paperwork. Thompson pushed himself upright, still favoring his ribs but mobile enough to rejoin the fight. Around the arena, other Marines began climbing back to their feet, wiping blood from split lips and checking bruised jaws. What had started as a demonstration was becoming something else entirely, a test not just of Rivers' limits, but of everything Camp Sentinel claimed to represent. "You want real training?" Blake asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the arena. "You want to see what these Marines can really do?" Rivers nodded once. "I want to see what I can really do." Blake smiled then, but it was the smile of a shark that had just spotted blood in the water. "Outstanding, Staff Sergeant. Truly outstanding." He turned to address the assembled Marines with theatrical flourish. "You heard the lady, gentlemen. She wants real training. She wants to test her limits. She wants to discover what she's truly capable of." The drill instructor's voice began to rise, carrying across the compound like a battle cry. "So let's give her exactly what she's asking for. No rotation, no rest periods, no mercy. Every Marine in this arena, all at once, until someone can't get back up." A collective intake of breath ran through the bleachers. What Blake was proposing wasn't training. It was a gang assault dressed up in military terminology, the kind of thing that ended careers when it made the wrong headlines, that generated congressional investigations and court-martial proceedings. But nobody spoke up. Nobody objected. Because this was Camp Sentinel, where the official rules were just suggestions and the real rules were written in sweat and blood and the kind of silence that complicity demanded. 12 Marines formed a loose circle around Rivers, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Thompson cracked his knuckles again, the sound sharp as breaking bones in the desert stillness. Torres rolled his shoulders, working out the kinks from his previous encounter with Rivers' elbows. Mason stretched his neck, the wrestler's instincts already calculating takedown angles and submission holds. But it was Cooper who stepped forward first, his pale eyes reflecting nothing but cold calculation. "You sure about this, Staff Sergeant? Once we start, there's no calling time out, no tapping out, no asking for mercy when you realize you've bitten off more than you can chew." Rivers looked around the circle of faces surrounding her. Young faces, hard faces, faces marked by combat and scarred by choices that had seemed necessary at the time. These were professional warriors, men who'd volunteered for the hardest assignments because easier ones didn't satisfy whatever hunger drove them forward. And they were all looking at her like she was prey. "I've never asked for mercy in my life," Rivers replied, her voice steady as granite. "I'm not starting today." Blake raised his hand again, the gesture sharp and final as an executioner's blade. Around the arena, the watching Marines fell silent, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. "Gentlemen," Blake announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Finish her off!" What happened next would be talked about in barracks around the world for decades. But could Rivers really survive what was coming? The attack came from all sides simultaneously. 12 sets of hands reaching for her, 12 bodies moving with coordinated precision, 12 minds focused on a single objective. Put the uppity female Marine down hard enough that she'd never forget her place in the natural order. Rivers moved like smoke in a hurricane, flowing between grasping hands and striking feet. Her body responding to threats her conscious mind hadn't even processed yet. A lifetime of training, martial arts classes as a child, hand-to-hand combat courses in the Marine Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan where hesitation meant death, compressed into pure instinct. Thompson's heavy right hand whistled past her ear as she ducked under Torres's hook. Mason shot for her legs while Nash tried to grab her from behind, but Rivers spun away from both attacks, her elbow catching Nash in the solar plexus as she flowed past him. The sand beneath her feet was deep and loose, making every step a calculated risk, every movement a test of balance and timing. Sweat stung her eyes and blood filled her mouth, but her breathing remained controlled, economical, the rhythm of someone who'd learned to find calm in the heart of chaos. Williams caught her with a glancing blow to the ribs that sent lightning bolts of pain up her spine, but Rivers absorbed the impact and kept moving, her knee finding his thigh with enough force to buckle his leg. Cooper slipped in behind her while she was dealing with Williams, his arms snaking around her throat in a textbook rear-naked choke. For a moment, the arena fell silent except for the sound of Rivers's labored breathing and Cooper's quiet grunts of effort as he tried to sink the hold deeper. This was how it would end, not with a dramatic knockout or spectacular submission, but with quiet strangulation in front of 30 witnesses who would all remember it differently when the investigation started. Rivers's vision began to narrow, black spots dancing at the edges of her sight as Cooper's arm compressed her carotid artery with professional precision. She could feel her strength ebbing, her legs beginning to shake under the dual assault of exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. That's when she remembered something her first martial arts instructor had told her 20 years ago, back when she was just a scrawny kid from Chicago who got picked on for being different. When you can't go forward and you can't go back, go down. Rivers dropped her full body weight suddenly, using gravity and Cooper's own grip against him. The unexpected shift in leverage broke his hold, and she rolled forward between his legs, coming up behind him before he could adjust. Her elbow found the pressure point just below his ear with surgical precision. Cooper dropped like he'd been shot, his body hitting the sand with a sound like a bag of cement falling from a truck. 11 Marines remained standing, but something had changed in their approach. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by professional wariness. This wasn't the easy victory they'd expected. This was work. Real work. Blake leaned forward on his platform, his hands gripping the concrete barrier hard enough to whiten his knuckles. This wasn't going according to plan. The lesson was supposed to be simple, direct, undeniable. Instead, he was watching one woman systematically dismantle his entire training philosophy in front of an audience that would talk about this day for years to come. And in the center of the arena, covered in blood and sand and the kind of determination that couldn't be taught or broken, Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers smiled through split lips and beckoned the remaining Marines forward. Who's next? The answer would shock everyone, because Rivers wasn't done, not by a long shot. The midday sun reached its apex over Camp Sentinel, transforming the arena into a crucible that seemed to distort reality itself. Heat waves rose from the concrete bleachers like ghostly fingers, and the sand beneath the fighters' feet had become so hot it could brand flesh through boot leather. But none of the remaining 11 Marines seemed to notice the temperature anymore. Their attention was focused entirely on the woman standing in the center of their closing circle, bloodied but unbroken, defiant in ways that challenged everything they thought they understood about combat, endurance, and the natural order of things. Rivers's breathing had shifted from controlled to labored, each inhalation a conscious effort that sent spikes of pain through her damaged ribs. Her left eye was swollen nearly shut, reducing her peripheral vision to a dangerous tunnel. Blood from various cuts had mixed with sweat and sand to create a gritty paste that she had to keep spitting from her mouth to maintain clear airways. But her hands were steady. Her stance remained balanced, and when she looked at the Marines surrounding her, there was no fear in her remaining good eye, only the cold calculation of someone who had moved beyond pain into a realm where survival was the only mathematics that mattered. Thompson approached from her right, his movements more cautious now, lacking the casual arrogance that had marked his earlier attacks. The big man had learned respect the hard way, and it showed in every careful step he took across the churned sand. "This doesn't have to get any uglier," he said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been concern. "You've made your point. Nobody's going to question your heart after this." Rivers wiped blood from her mouth with the back of her hand, the gesture leaving another dark streak across her cheek. "My point?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "What point is that, Corporal?" Torres circled to her left, the boxer's trained footwork keeping him at optimal distance for quick combinations. "That you're tough," he said. "That you don't quit easy. That you can take a beating and keep coming back for more. Is that what you think this is about?" Rivers's laugh was short and sharp, like breaking glass. "Taking a beating?" Mason moved to fill the gap between Thompson and Torres, his wrestler's instincts reading the geometry of the arena, calculating angles and distances. "What else would it be about? You're outnumbered 12-1. You're hurt. You're tired. Nobody expects you to—" "Finish her off," Rivers interrupted, her voice cutting through Mason's words like a blade through silk. "That's what your drill instructor said, wasn't it? Finish her off." The arena fell silent except for the whisper of desert wind and the distant rumble of helicopters conducting training exercises somewhere beyond the base perimeter. Even the Marines in the bleachers stopped their nervous shuffling, sensing that something fundamental was about to shift in the brutal calculus playing out in the sand below. Blake leaned forward on his concrete platform, his face flushed with heat and something that might have been growing unease. This had gone far beyond standard training protocol, far beyond acceptable risk management, far beyond anything that could be explained away in an after-action report. "You want to know what this is really about?" Rivers continued, her voice rising just enough to carry to every corner of the arena. "It's not about proving I can take a beating. It's not about showing I don't quit easy. It's about showing you what happens when someone finally hits back." She stepped forward suddenly, closing the distance to Thompson before the big man could adjust his guard. Her left hand found his wrist, while her right drove into his solar plexus with surgical precision. Thompson doubled over, gasping, and Rivers's knee met his descending face with the sound of a baseball bat hitting a watermelon. Thompson went down hard, his body hitting the sand with a finality that suggested he wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. 10 Marines remained standing, but their formation had shifted from aggressive confidence to defensive uncertainty. Torres came in fast, his boxing training evident in the crisp combinations he threw at Rivers's head and body. But Rivers had been reading his rhythm for the past hour, learning the subtle tells that preceded each punch, the slight shoulder dip before his left hook, the way his weight shifted before his right cross. She slipped inside his guard like smoke through a keyhole, her elbow finding the nerve cluster below his ribs that she'd targeted so effectively on Thompson earlier. Torres's hands dropped involuntarily, and Rivers's uppercut caught him clean on the point of his chin. The boxer's legs turned to rubber, and he toppled backward into the sand like a felled tree. 9 Marines left. Mason shot for a desperate takedown, his wrestling instincts telling him that the fight needed to go to the ground where numbers might matter more than striking precision. But Rivers had been expecting it, had been reading his body language for the past several minutes. She sprawled expertly, using his momentum against him, and Mason found himself face first in the sand, with Rivers's knee pressed against his spine. A quick adjustment of pressure and leverage, and Mason went limp, his body's protective reflexes shutting down rather than risk permanent damage. 8 Marines left. The remaining fighters began to spread out, their earlier pack tactics abandoned in favor of individual survival. What had started as a coordinated assault was degenerating into chaos as each man tried to calculate his odds of walking away from this encounter without permanent damage to body or reputation. Nash charged in with the reckless courage of youth, throwing wild haymakers that would have knocked Rivers' head off if they'd connected. They didn't connect. Rivers moved like water around his attacks, her counter-strikes finding targets with the precision of a surgeon and the force of a wrecking ball. Nash joined the growing collection of unconscious Marines littering the arena floor. 7 left. Williams tried a different approach, using his reach advantage to keep Rivers at distance while looking for an opening to land one of his famous sledgehammer hands. But Rivers had been fighting taller opponents her entire career, had learned to close distance against men who thought their size was their greatest weapon. She got inside his guard during a momentary lapse in concentration, her hands working like pistons against his ribs and solar plexus. Williams staggered backward, his face gray with pain, and Rivers's spinning heel kick caught him behind the ear. 6 Marines remained standing, but their body language had shifted from aggressive to purely defensive. What had begun as a lesson in dominance had become a masterclass in the difference between training and actual combat experience. Blake gripped the concrete barrier of his platform until his knuckles went white, his face a mask of disbelief and growing panic. This wasn't just embarrassing, this was career-ending. This was the kind of incident that generated congressional investigations and court-martial proceedings and very uncomfortable questions about leadership and judgment. But more immediately, this was becoming something that resembled a war crime dressed up as a training exercise. And there was no way to stop it without admitting that it should never have started in the first place. But Rivers wasn't done yet, and what she was about to do would ensure Blake never gave another illegal order again. In the bleachers, Marines who had been cheering for blood and domination now sat in stunned silence, watching their worldview crumble with each body that hit the sand. Some of them were beginning to inch toward the exits, suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere on the base. The 6 remaining fighters formed a loose circle around Rivers, but their movements lacked the coordinated precision of their earlier attacks. Fear was a virus in their formation, spreading from man to man with each display of Rivers's relentless efficiency. "She's not human," someone whispered from the bleachers. "Normal people don't fight like that." But Rivers was very human. Human enough to feel every bruise, every cut, every tortured breath that reminded her of damaged ribs. Human enough to taste blood and sand and the copper tang of adrenaline. Human enough to know that she was running on borrowed time and sheer stubbornness. The difference was that she had moved beyond the normal human response to pain and exhaustion and overwhelming odds. She had entered the realm that combat veterans knew well, but rarely spoke about, the place where rational thought gave way to pure survival instinct, where the body continued fighting long after the mind had stopped calculating odds. She was operating on muscle memory and determination now, her conscious mind reduced to a narrow focus that saw only targets and opportunities, threats and responses. This was what 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught her, what years of training had prepared her for, what every drill instructor who had tried to break her spirit had accidentally forged into an unbreakable weapon. The remaining Marines could see it in her eyes now, the cold certainty of someone who had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. She wasn't just fighting to prove a point anymore. She was fighting to finish what they had started, and in the growing silence of the arena, punctuated only by the sound of heavy breathing and the whisper of sand across concrete, everyone present began to understand that this story was going to end very differently than anyone had expected. One by one, the remaining 6 Marines fell. Peterson with his sledgehammer hands, Martinez with his fire hydrant build, the others whose names would be forgotten, but whose defeat would be remembered, until only Rivers remained standing in the center of the arena, surrounded by 12 bodies in various stages of unconsciousness and defeat. But the most important moment was still to come, and Blake was about to face consequences he never imagined. The aftermath of violence always carried its own strange silence, a quietude that seemed to absorb sound and leave only the essential. Breathing, heartbeat, the whisper of sand settling back into patterns disturbed by combat. Rivers stood alone in the center of the arena, surrounded by 12 bodies in various stages of unconsciousness and defeat, her chest rising and falling with the controlled rhythm of someone who had learned to manage pain through sheer discipline. 6 Marines remained technically conscious, though their definition of standing had become increasingly flexible. Peterson leaned heavily against the arena wall, one hand pressed to his ribs where Rivers's knee had found its mark. Jackson sat in the sand, shaking his head slowly as if trying to clear cobwebs from his brain. Blake descended from his platform with the mechanical movements of a man whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed around him. His face had shifted from red to pale gray, the color of concrete in winter, and his hands trembled slightly as he approached the carnage that had once been a training exercise. "Stand down," he said, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Training exercise concluded. All personnel return to—" "No." Rivers's voice cut through his words like a scalpel through skin. She turned to face the drill instructor, and Blake took an involuntary step backward when he saw her eyes. Not the eyes of someone who had just survived a beating, but the eyes of someone who had just discovered exactly what she was capable of when pushed beyond normal human limits. "We're not finished here, drill instructor," Rivers continued, her voice carrying clearly across the arena, despite the hoarseness that came from exertion and controlled breathing. "You said this was about learning, about discovering what we're really made of when the chips are down." Blake's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish gasping for air. Around the bleachers, Marines who had been expecting entertainment now sat in uncomfortable silence, suddenly aware that they were witnesses to something that would require very careful explanations in very official reports. Rivers began walking toward Blake with deliberate steps, each footfall leaving a clear impression in the sand that had been churned into powder by an hour of systematic violence. Blood from various cuts had dried into dark streaks across her face and arms, and her left eye remained swollen nearly shut. But her posture remained military perfect. "So let's learn," she said. "Let's discover what happens when someone finally stands up to a bully who's been hiding behind his rank and his authority and his carefully rigged games." Blake found his voice, though it came out higher than usual. "Staff Sergeant, you are in direct violation of orders. You will stand down immediately and report to—" "Report to who?" Rivers asked, still advancing. "You? The man who just ordered 12 Marines to assault a superior officer during a training exercise? The man who turned a professional facility into his personal gladiator pit?" The remaining conscious Marines began backing away from the confrontation, their survival instincts finally overriding their loyalty to Blake. This had moved far beyond anything they wanted to be associated with, far beyond anything that could be explained as standard training protocol. Blake pulled out his radio with shaking hands. "Base security, this is Drill Instructor Blake. I need immediate backup at the combat conditioning arena. We have an unstable Marine who—" Rivers's hand moved faster than thought, snatching the radio from Blake's grip and crushing it against the concrete wall with enough force to reduce it to plastic fragments and twisted metal. The sound echoed across the arena like a gunshot. "Unstable?" Rivers asked, her voice carrying a dangerous edge that made even the Marines in the bleachers lean back in their seats. "Is that what you're going to call this? An unstable Marine who couldn't handle proper training?" Blake stumbled backward, his authority evaporating like water in the desert heat. For 8 years, he had ruled this facility through fear and intimidation, had broken spirits and crushed dreams with the casual efficiency of an industrial machine. But now he found himself face to face with someone who had absorbed everything he could deliver and remained standing. More than standing, victorious. Rivers stopped just out of arm's reach, close enough that Blake could see the damage he had orchestrated, the swollen eye, the split lip, the cuts and bruises that mapped every blow she had absorbed. But he could also see something else in her remaining good eye, something that made his blood run cold. Triumph. Not just survival, not just endurance, but absolute, undeniable victory. "You wanted to see what I was made of," Rivers said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. "You wanted to test my limits. You wanted to prove that some people don't belong in your sacred institution." She gestured toward the 12 Marines scattered across the arena floor, some unconscious, others groaning as they tried to piece together what had just happened to their carefully ordered universe. "Mission accomplished, drill instructor. You've learned exactly what I'm made of. The question now is, what are you going to do with that knowledge?" Blake opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. What could he say? That this had been standard training? That 12-on-1 assaults were normal combat conditioning? That ordering Marines to finish off a superior officer was acceptable military protocol? Behind him, the arena began to empty as Marines found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. They filed out in small groups, their conversations hushed and nervous, already beginning the process of collective amnesia that military institutions use to protect themselves from inconvenient truths. But Rivers wasn't finished. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital device that had been recording throughout the entire encounter. The red light blinked steadily, indicating that every word, every blow, every illegal order had been captured in high-definition detail. "Body cam," she explained, noting Blake's expression of dawning horror. "Standard issue for combat zone deployments. Funny thing about habits you develop in Afghanistan, you tend to keep them even in supposedly safe environments." Blake's legs gave out, and he sat down heavily in the sand, his face now the color of old concrete. The implications hit him like artillery shells. Court-martial proceedings, congressional investigations, the end of his military career, possible criminal charges for assault and abuse of authority. 23 years, he whispered. More to himself than to Rivers. 23 years of service? Gone. Rivers looked down at him without pity, her voice carrying the flat finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. 23 years of bullying dressed up as training. 23 years of breaking people who trusted you to make them stronger. 23 years of hiding behind your rank while you turned good Marines into accomplices in your personal power fantasies. She knelt beside him in the sand, close enough that only he could hear her next words. "You wanted to finish me off, drill instructor, but the only thing that got finished here today was your career." Rivers stood and walked toward the arena exit, leaving Blake sitting alone among the wreckage of his authority. Behind her, the remaining conscious Marines began helping their unconscious teammates to their feet, their movements careful and subdued, like people cleaning up after a natural disaster. At the arena entrance, Rivers paused and turned back to address the few Marines still present. "Anyone who wants to discuss what happened here today, I'll be in my quarters. Anyone who wants to pretend it didn't happen, that's your choice. But understand this, the old rules just changed. The games just ended. From now on, this facility operates according to actual military protocol, not personal vendettas." She walked out into the blazing Arizona afternoon, leaving behind an arena full of unconscious Marines, a broken drill instructor, and a legend that would be told and retold in barracks around the world for decades to come. The woman who took down 12 Marines with broken ribs. The woman who ended a career with a body cam and the courage to stand up when everyone else looked away. The woman who proved that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to hit back harder than they ever imagined possible. And in the empty arena, with the desert wind beginning to cover the bloodstains with fresh sand, drill instructor Marcus Blake sat alone and contemplated the end of everything he had thought he understood about power, authority, and the price of pushing people too far. But this story wasn't over yet. The real consequences were just beginning. The base infirmary buzzed with the kind of controlled chaos that followed any major training incident at Camp Sentinel. Corpsmen moved between examination rooms with practiced efficiency, checking pupils for concussion signs, x-raying potentially fractured bones, and documenting injuries that would require careful explanation in official reports. Dr. Rachel Martinez, the chief medical officer, had seen her share of training accidents over 15 years of military service. But the parade of Marines filing through her facility that afternoon raised questions that went far beyond standard medical protocols. 12 Marines, all from the same training exercise, all with injuries consistent with hand-to-hand combat, all claiming they had fallen during an obstacle course run. The same obstacle course run at the same time in the same way. Corporal Thompson, Dr. Martinez said, reviewing the chart for the third Marine she'd examined in the past hour. You're telling me you suffered a solar plexus contusion and a possible concussion from falling off the rope climb? Thompson nodded carefully, wincing as the movement aggravated his bruised ribs. Yes, ma'am. Lost my grip, fell backward, hit the ground pretty hard. Dr. Martinez made a note in his file, her expression professionally neutral despite the growing pattern of inconsistencies. And Sergeant Torres, who was just in here, claims he fell from the same rope climb at approximately the same time. Training accidents happen, ma'am, sometimes in clusters. Clusters, Dr. Martinez repeated. Interesting word choice. She finished her examination and moved to the next bay where Lance Corporal Williams sat on the examination table, one side of his face swollen and discolored. His story matched the others with suspicious precision. Rope climb, loss of grip, unfortunate landing. Mr. Williams, Dr. Martinez said, pulling up a chair to sit at eye level with him. In 15 years of treating military personnel, I've seen rope climb accidents, obstacle course injuries, and training mishaps of every variety. What I haven't seen is 12 Marines suffering identical injuries from identical accidents during the same exercise. Williams shifted uncomfortably on the examination table, his eyes focused on a spot somewhere above the doctor's shoulder. Sometimes things just line up wrong, Doc. Murphy's Law in action. Dr. Martinez stood and made another note in the file, her pen scratching across paper with deliberate emphasis. Murphy's Law, right. Well, Mr. Williams, Murphy's Law also suggests that when multiple Marines lie to a medical officer about the source of their injuries, someone's going to end up in very serious trouble. She moved to the next examination room where Sergeant Jackson sat holding an ice pack to his jaw. His story began the same way. Routine training, obstacle course, unfortunate fall. But Dr. Martinez had stopped listening to the words and started reading the subtext written in nervous glances and defensive postures. Sergeant Jackson, she interrupted mid-explanation, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to think very carefully before you answer. Were you and your fellow Marines assaulted during this training exercise? Jackson's ice pack paused halfway to his face. Assaulted, ma'am? No, ma'am, nothing like that. Just training accidents, like I said. Training accidents that left 12 grown Marines injured badly enough to require medical attention. Training accidents that resulted in concussion protocols for half your unit. Training accidents that somehow managed to spare every other Marine participating in the same exercise. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Jackson finally lowered the ice pack, revealing a jaw that was swollen enough to suggest significant impact trauma. "Doc, with respect, you don't understand how things work at advanced training facilities. Sometimes the training gets intense. Sometimes people get hurt. That's the price of being prepared for real combat." Dr. Martinez leaned forward in her chair, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Sergeant, I've treated Marines who've been through real combat. I've patched up men who've survived IED explosions, firefights, and hand-to-hand combat in Afghanistan and Iraq. I know what combat injuries look like." She gestured toward his swollen jaw, then toward the examination rooms where his fellow Marines were receiving treatment. "These aren't combat injuries, Sergeant. These are assault injuries. Someone systematically worked over 12 trained Marines with surgical precision, targeting nerve clusters, pressure points, and vulnerable areas with the kind of expertise that comes from extensive martial arts training or special operations experience." Jackson's face had gone pale beneath his bruises. Dr. Martinez pressed her advantage. "More specifically, these injuries suggest a single attacker working against multiple opponents, someone smaller than most of you, based on the angle of impact on some of these strikes. Someone with advanced combat training who knew exactly where to hit for maximum effect with minimum permanent damage." The ice pack slipped from Jackson's fingers, hitting the floor with a wet splat that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. "There's only one person assigned to your training rotation who fits that profile," Dr. Martinez continued. "Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers, 2 tours in Afghanistan, Bronze Star for Valor, advanced martial arts certifications, and according to her file, she's about 5'6" and 130 pounds. Jackson opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again without making a sound. "So I'm going to ask you again, Sergeant Jackson, and this time I want the truth. Did Staff Sergeant Rivers do this to you?" Jackson stared at the floor for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You don't understand, Doc. It wasn't like that. She didn't attack us. He stopped, realizing he was about to admit to something that would require official action. "You what, Sergeant?" Jackson looked up at her, his eyes reflecting something that might have been shame. "We were following orders, Doc. Drill Instructor Blake ordered us to provide intensive combat conditioning for Staff Sergeant Rivers." Dr. Martinez felt something cold settle in her stomach. 12 against 1. That's not combat conditioning, Sergeant. That's assault. Blake said it was about testing limits, about finding out what she was really made of, about proving that some people don't belong in advanced training. Jackson's voice was getting stronger, as if confession was lifting a weight from his shoulders. "But Christ, Doc, she took us apart like we were basic training recruits. All of us. At the same time." Dr. Martinez stood up slowly, her mind already moving to the next phase of what had suddenly become a much more serious situation. "Sergeant Jackson, I'm going to need you to write down everything that happened during this exercise. Every detail you can remember. Times, locations, witnesses, exact words spoken." "Doc, if I do that..." "If you don't do that, you're going to be complicit in covering up what amounts to an illegal assault on a superior officer. And when the investigation starts, and it will start, because I'm required by regulation to report suspected abuse incidents, your silence is going to look like obstruction of justice." Jackson nodded slowly, the full weight of his situation finally settling on his shoulders. "What's going to happen to Blake?" Dr. Martinez was already moving toward the door, her mind focused on the phone call she needed to make, the reports she needed to file, the chain of command that needed to be notified immediately. "That's not my decision, Sergeant. That's going to be up to people with much more authority than a base medical officer. But I can tell you this. Ordering subordinates to assault a superior officer during a training exercise is grounds for court-martial under multiple articles of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." She paused at the door and turned back to face Jackson. "The only question now is whether you and your fellow Marines are going to be treated as victims of illegal orders or as willing participants in assault. I suggest you choose your next words very carefully." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the examination room like a gunshot. Jackson sat alone with the ice pack melting at his feet and the growing realization that the events in the arena had set in motion a chain reaction that would reach far beyond Camp Sentinel. And in her office, Dr. Martinez was about to make the call that would change everything. In her office, Dr. Martinez reached for the secure phone that connected directly to the base commander's office. The conversation that followed would be brief, professional, and absolutely devastating to everyone involved in the morning's training exercise. Within an hour, investigators would be dispatched from Quantico. Within 6 hours, Drill Instructor Blake would be relieved of duty and confined to quarters pending formal charges. Within 24 hours, the story of the woman who took down 12 Marines with broken ribs would be classified material under active investigation. But some stories are too powerful to contain, too remarkable to suppress, too important to forget. And this was one of them. The conference room at Marine Corps Base Quantico felt like a courtroom designed by architects who understood the weight of military justice. Polished oak table, brass fixtures that gleamed under fluorescent lighting, and portraits of distinguished Marines watching from the walls with the kind of stern disapproval reserved for those who had dishonored the uniform. Colonel Rebecca Stone sat at the head of the table, her silver eagles catching the overhead light as she reviewed the stack of documents that had arrived from Camp Sentinel via secure courier just 12 hours earlier. Medical reports, witness statements, digital recordings, and photographs that painted a picture so disturbing it had prompted an immediate suspension of all training operations at the facility. To her right sat Lieutenant Colonel James Park from the Judge Advocate General's office, his fingers steepled as he reviewed legal precedents for cases involving assault under color of authority. To her left, Major Sandra Walsh from the Inspector General's office made careful notes in a leather portfolio, her expression growing grimmer with each page she turned. The fourth person in the room wore no uniform at all. Dr. Patricia Hernandez from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, a civilian investigator whose presence indicated that this case had already moved beyond internal military discipline into the realm of potential criminal prosecution. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Stone began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded Marines in 3 combat deployments. "We are here to determine the facts surrounding an incident at Camp Sentinel that, if the preliminary reports are accurate, represents one of the most serious breaches of military discipline and leadership in recent memory." She lifted the top document from the stack in front of her. Dr. Martinez's initial incident report, filed according to mandatory protocols for suspected assault cases. On the morning of March 15th, Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers participated in what was officially designated as a combat conditioning exercise under the supervision of drill instructor Sergeant Marcus Blake. According to witness statements and digital evidence, this exercise consisted of 12 Marines attacking a single superior officer in what can only be described as a sanctioned assault. Lieutenant Colonel Park cleared his throat. "Ma'am, the preliminary interviews suggest that the Marines involved believed they were following legitimate training orders. The question becomes whether they should be charged as willing participants or as victims of illegal command authority." Colonel Stone nodded grimly. "A question we'll address shortly, but first, let's review what actually happened in that arena." She activated a digital projector, and the wall-mounted screen filled with still images captured from Rivers's body camera recording. The timestamp showed 0847 hours, and the image displayed 12 Marines arranged in a circle around a single female Marine. "This is the moment Sergeant Blake issued his final order, and I quote, 'Finish her off.'" The digital recording captures not only his words, but the laughter from several participants and the lack of any objection from supervising personnel. The next image showed Rivers's face after the first wave of attacks. Swollen eye, split lip, blood mixing with sand and sweat. But her posture remained defiant, her stance that of someone preparing to continue fighting rather than surrender. What happened next? Colonel Stone continued, advancing through a series of images that documented the systematic dismantling of 12 trained Marines. Defies conventional understanding of combat dynamics, military training protocols, and basic human endurance. Major Walsh looked up from her notes. "Ma'am, I've reviewed Staff Sergeant Rivers's service record. 2 combat tours, Bronze Star for Valor, Expert Marksman, Advanced Martial Arts certifications. But nothing in her background suggests the capability to single-handedly defeat 12 opponents in hand-to-hand combat." Dr. Hernandez spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of someone who had investigated military scandals for 2 decades. "Major Walsh, you're thinking about this incorrectly. The question isn't whether Rivers had the capability to defeat 12 opponents under normal circumstances. The question is, what happens when someone with her training and combat experience is pushed beyond normal human limits by what amounts to torture disguised as training?" She gestured toward the screen, which now showed an image of Rivers standing alone in the center of the arena, surrounded by unconscious or defeated Marines. "What we're looking at here is the result of systematic brutalization that triggered what psychologists call survival transcendence, a state where normal physical and mental limitations are temporarily overcome by pure survival instinct. It's been documented in combat veterans who've survived impossible odds, in civilians who've lifted cars off trapped children, in people who've fought off multiple attackers against all rational possibility." Colonel Stone advanced to the final image, Blake sitting alone in the sand, his face reflecting the dawning realization that his career was over. According to witness statements, this is when Sergeant Blake attempted to radio for base security, claiming that Rivers was an unstable Marine who had attacked his personnel. "And this," she continued, displaying an image of Rivers crushing the radio against the concrete wall, "is when Rivers ensured that the only version of events that would reach official channels was the truth captured on her body camera." The room fell silent as the implications settled like dust after an explosion. This wasn't just about one drill instructor's abuse of authority or one training exercise gone wrong. This was about systemic failures that had allowed toxic leadership to flourish unchecked, about institutional blindness that had ignored warning signs until catastrophe became inevitable. Lieutenant Colonel Park was the first to speak. "Ma'am, what's our legal exposure here? If this becomes public, if Congress gets involved, if the media picks up the story of a female Marine being ordered to fight 12 men simultaneously, our legal exposure is the least of our concerns," Colonel Stone replied sharply. "Our moral exposure, our institutional credibility, our basic claim to honor and integrity as an institution, those are the things that matter here." She turned to face the group directly, her expression carrying the weight of command decisions that would echo through the Marine Corps for years to come. "Sergeant Blake will face court-martial on charges of assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming, and violation of his oath as a Marine. The 12 Marines who participated will face non-judicial punishment unless our investigation reveals they acted with malicious intent rather than misguided obedience." Major Walsh made a note. "And Staff Sergeant Rivers?" "Staff Sergeant Rivers will receive a formal commendation for courage under fire and will be transferred to a position where her talents can be properly utilized rather than systematically attacked. She'll also receive a public apology from the highest levels of this institution." Dr. Hernandez closed her portfolio with a soft snap. "Colonel Stone, my office will be conducting a comprehensive review of training protocols at all advanced combat facilities. What happened at Sentinel didn't occur in a vacuum. It was enabled by systemic failures that reach far beyond one rogue drill instructor." "Agreed," Colonel Stone replied. "And that review starts today. Every advanced training facility, every drill instructor, every protocol that allows individual Marines to wield unchecked authority over others. We're going to tear it down and rebuild it according to actual military values rather than glorified hazing traditions. She stood up, signaling the end of the formal portion of the meeting. Gentlemen, Dr. Hernandez, what happened in that arena yesterday was an abomination, but it was also a wake-up call. Staff Sergeant Rivers didn't just defeat 12 attackers. She exposed decades of institutional rot that we've been pretending didn't exist. Colonel Stone walked to the window overlooking the Quantico training facilities, where Marines conducted their daily routines under the watchful eyes of instructors who, until yesterday, had operated under very different assumptions about acceptable training methods. The story of what happened at Camp Sentinel will spread through the Corps, whether we want it to or not. Stories that powerful have their own momentum, their own life force. The question is, whether we control the narrative by admitting our failures and demonstrating our commitment to change, or whether we let others tell it for us. She turned back to face the group, her expression resolute. We're going to tell it ourselves. We're going to own our mistakes, honor our heroes, and prove that the Marine Corps is still capable of learning from its failures. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers gave us a gift when she refused to quit in that arena. She gave us the truth. The least we can do is have the courage to act on it. The meeting ended with the kind of silence that follows momentous decisions, the quiet understanding that everything was about to change, that institutional inertia had finally met an immovable force in the form of one woman's refusal to accept unacceptable treatment. In offices across Quantico, phones began ringing as the machinery of military justice ground into motion. At Camp Sentinel, Blake sat in confinement while investigators combed through years of training records, looking for patterns, precedents, and other victims who had never found the courage or opportunity to fight back. And somewhere in the vast complexity of the military bureaucracy, a commendation was being written for a Marine who had done something that would be remembered long after the bureaucrats and administrators had retired. She had stood up when everyone else looked away. And she had proven that sometimes the only way to stop institutional bullying is to hit back harder than the bullies ever imagined possible. 6 months later, everything had changed, and Rivers was about to begin the most important work of her career. 6 months later, the morning sun rose over Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton with the same relentless intensity it had always brought to Southern California. But the Advanced Combat Training Center that sprawled across its eastern quadrant operated under fundamentally different principles than the facility that had once existed at Camp Sentinel. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers stood at the edge of the main training arena, watching a mixed group of Marines and Navy SEALs work through close-quarters combat scenarios under the supervision of instructors who understood that breaking people and building warriors were two entirely different missions. Her left eye had healed completely, leaving only the faintest scar above her eyebrow as a reminder of that March morning when everything had changed. The new facility bore little resemblance to the gladiatorial pit where Blake had orchestrated his reign of terror. Gone were the concrete bleachers that had seated audiences for systematic humiliation. Gone were the isolation chambers where troublemakers had been sent to contemplate their failures. Gone were the unwritten rules that had elevated cruelty to the level of institutional doctrine. In their place stood a state-of-the-art training complex, designed around principles of progressive development, mutual respect, and the kind of professional excellence that produced elite warriors rather than broken spirits. The combat conditioning program that had once relied on intimidation and degradation now focused on building confidence, competence, and the unshakable bonds that held fighting units together under impossible pressure. Rivers carried a new title along with her new assignment, Senior Instructor for Advanced Combatives and Leadership Development. The position had been created specifically for her, recognizing not just her technical expertise, but her demonstrated ability to maintain professional standards under the most extreme provocation. "Ma'am," a voice called from behind her. Rivers turned to see Corporal Jennifer Martinez approaching with the kind of confident stride that marked the new generation of Marines being produced by the reformed training program. Martinez was one of 12 female Marines who had volunteered for the first integrated advanced combat course, women who had chosen to test themselves against the highest standards rather than accept reduced expectations. "Yes, Corporal?" "The 1400 session is ready to begin. 24 participants, mixed gender, all volunteers for high-intensity conditioning." Martinez paused, her expression shifting to something that might have been concern. "Ma'am, we've got 3 Marines in this group who were at Camp Sentinel. They requested assignment to your training rotation specifically." Rivers nodded slowly. The aftermath of the investigation had scattered the survivors of Blake's program across the Marine Corps, some seeking redemption, others trying to forget, most simply trying to understand what they had witnessed and participated in during those final days of institutional madness. "Which 3, Corporal?" "Sergeant Jackson, Corporal Peterson, and Lance Corporal Williams. They've all completed remedial leadership training and psychological evaluation. Their commanding officers recommend them for advanced instruction." Rivers walked toward the training arena, her boots clicking against concrete that had been poured with proper drainage, appropriate safety margins, and none of the deliberate design flaws that had made Camp Sentinel such an effective tool for breaking spirits. The 24 Marines stood at attention in formation, their faces reflecting the kind of focused determination that came from volunteers rather than conscripts. Among them, Rivers recognized the 3 men who had once participated in her systematic assault, their postures now reflecting something that might have been humility mixed with professional respect. "Good afternoon, Marines," Rivers began, her voice carrying clearly across the formation. "Today marks the beginning of 6 weeks of advanced combat conditioning designed to test your limits, expand your capabilities, and prepare you for situations where conventional training isn't sufficient." She paused, her eyes moving across the faces in front of her, reading the mixture of anticipation and nervousness that always marked the beginning of serious training. "This program will push you beyond what you thought possible. You will be tired, sore, frustrated, and occasionally convinced that you've made a terrible mistake. But you will not be bullied, humiliated, or subjected to treatment that has nothing to do with building military capability." Jackson stepped forward 1 pace. "Ma'am, permission to speak?" "Granted." "Ma'am, speaking for myself and the others from Camp Sentinel, we want you to know that we understand what happened there was wrong. We were following orders, but that doesn't excuse our participation. We're here to learn how to be better Marines and better leaders." Rivers studied his face, seeing none of the casual arrogance that had marked their first encounter. None of the toxic confidence that had enabled systematic abuse under the guise of military tradition. "Sergeant Jackson, what happened at Camp Sentinel was the result of institutional failures that went far beyond individual choices. You were young Marines following orders from authority figures you had been trained to trust. The responsibility belongs to those who created that system, not to those who were trapped within it." She stepped closer to the formation, close enough that her words would carry weight without seeming like a lecture. "But you're right about one thing. You have an opportunity here to learn something different, not just about combat techniques or physical conditioning, but about what leadership actually means when you're responsible for other people's lives and welfare." Rivers moved to the center of the training area, where equipment had been arranged for the day's exercises. Unlike the bare sand pit of Camp Sentinel, this space featured proper mats, safety equipment, and medical stations staffed by qualified corpsmen. "Advanced combat training isn't about proving who's tougher or meaner or more willing to inflict pain," she continued. "It's about developing the kind of unshakable competence that keeps people alive when everything goes wrong. It's about building trust so complete that Marines will follow you into situations where following means almost certain death." She gestured toward a series of obstacle courses that had been designed to challenge without destroying, to test limits without breaking spirits. You can't build that kind of trust through fear or intimidation. You can't develop that kind of competence through hazing or systematic humiliation. You can only achieve it through professional excellence, mutual respect, and the kind of leadership that elevates everyone around you. The formation remained silent, but Rivers could see the shift in their attention, the way 24 pairs of eyes had focused with the intensity that marked Marines who understood they were about to learn something important. The story of what happened at Camp Sentinel has become legend throughout the Corps, Rivers said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow carried more authority than shouting would have. Some of those stories are accurate. Most are exaggerated. All of them miss the point. She began walking along the front rank, making eye contact with each Marine in turn. The point isn't that I defeated 12 opponents in hand-to-hand combat. The point is that 12 good Marines were put in a position where they felt compelled to follow illegal orders because they had been systematically conditioned to believe that questioning authority was weakness. Rivers stopped in front of Peterson, the massive Marine who had once been known as Hammer for his devastating punching power. His face reflected something that might have been shame mixed with understanding. The point isn't that I refused to quit when outnumbered and outmuscled. The point is that institutional rot had progressed so far that a training exercise designed to build warriors had become nothing more than sanctioned assault disguised as military tradition. She turned to address the entire formation again, her voice rising slightly to carry across the training area. You are here to become elite Marines. Not because you can absorb more punishment than other people. Not because you can inflict more damage on opponents. But because you can maintain professional standards under impossible pressure and lead others to do the same. Rivers walked toward the equipment stations where the day's training would begin, scenarios designed to test judgment under stress, coordination under pressure, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated competent Marines from exceptional ones. The old system at Camp Sentinel produced Marines who could follow orders without question, even when those orders were morally wrong and professionally inappropriate. The new system you're entering today will produce Marines who can think independently, act decisively, and maintain their integrity even when authority figures fail to maintain theirs. She turned back to face the formation one final time, her expression reflecting the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst the system could deliver and emerged stronger rather than broken. Welcome to Advanced Combat Training, Marines. Let's see what you're really made of. As the formation dispersed toward their assigned training stations, Rivers caught Jackson's eye one more time. The sergeant approached with deliberate steps, his posture reflecting something that might have been gratitude mixed with professional respect. Ma'am, he said quietly, thank you for giving us another chance. Rivers nodded once. Sergeant Jackson, everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment. The question is what you do with that opportunity. She walked toward the instructor's station where other senior Marines waited to begin the day's scenarios, leaving behind a training area filled with the sound of professional military instruction rather than systematic degradation. In the distance, helicopters practiced formation, flying over the California hills, their rotors beating a rhythm that spoke of preparation rather than intimidation. The Marine Corps was learning to build warriors through excellence rather than brutality, to develop leaders through professional development rather than hazing, to honor the uniform through competence rather than cruelty. It was a lesson written in blood and sand in an Arizona arena, taught by a woman who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier, and learned by an institution that finally found the courage to change rather than simply endure. The story of Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers would be told and retold in barracks around the world for generations to come, not as a tale of impossible physical prowess, but as a reminder that sometimes the most important battles are fought not against foreign enemies, but against the failures within our own institutions. And sometimes, when you stand up to bullies who think rank gives them the right to break spirits, you discover that the only thing that gets broken is their power to hurt others. That lesson, learned in blood and validated through institutional change, was worth every bruise, every scar, and every moment of pain it had cost to teach. This story stands as a testament to courage, integrity, and the power of one person to change an entire system. Staff Sergeant Jordan Rivers didn't just survive, she transformed the very institution that tried to break her. Her legacy lives on in every Marine who trains under the new system, in every leader who chooses excellence over cruelty, and in every person who finds the courage to stand up when everyone else looks away. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because stories like this remind us that real strength isn't about how much pain you can inflict. It's about how much you can endure while never losing sight of what's right.